I'm a senior media analyst at TD Cowen, and I'm delighted to have Frode Jacobsen with me from Opera this morning. Frode joined Opera in 2013 and became the CFO in 2016, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And he's a McKinsey consulting alum who hails from Norway. He's come a long way to be with us today, and I'm very grateful to have him here with us, so thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So let's just start with the current demand environment and the outlook. And I know this is an area where we get a ton of calls. There's just so much agita about media spending. And certainly, if we look at the big players in the space, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Snaps and so forth, they've had better days, to say the least. But, what are you seeing? I mean, obviously you've been growing much more rapidly than your larger, more mature peers. And we'll get into why, but what's your sense for the underlying advertising climate these days?
To us, of course, the underlying climate is the same, but it's probably a good period to be the underdog, kind of. We're not already fully penetrated, or maybe they're not fully penetrated, but not as big as those peers that you mentioned. So I think we see the same pressure from advertisers that everyone else, but at the same time, we still have so much growth potential, and that's what we've been benefiting from over these past years and also through the prior year, so enabling us to sort of still grow very, very nicely.
So are you getting any sense that the trends have worsened or are getting better or about the same since you last reported? And again, I'm just not referring to your specific numbers. I know you can't talk about that.
Yeah. No, I think it's more a period of general uncertainty, almost anxiousness in companies, cautiousness. I wouldn't say there's any major change over the past few months alone, but it's we just prepared a bit for volatile times. That's what we keep in the back of our minds when we set guidance and when we communicate our outlook, etc. To just build in the fact that things seem to be more uncertain.
Okay, so before we get into the growth drivers, could you just sort of help us level set in terms of your category exposure? Is that irrelevant as we think about the verticals that your customers are making up generally? And I guess where I'm going with this is, obviously we know that there have been some sectors, emerging tech, crypto, online gaming, that have sort of come way off from where they were a year ago, and some other companies that had exposure to those sectors have really suffered in the beginning parts of this year. Do you have exposure to those sectors or other kind of problem sectors?
We don't really think of ourselves as too sector oriented, because what we have is a 300+ million user base, so it's a big audience, and then people bid for that traffic. I think our verticals, like the underlying, is it travel, is it e-commerce, is it this and that, it's been relatively stable. We saw the same as everyone else, like travel was weaker during the pandemic and so on, but then e-commerce really stepped in. But it's just relatively stable.
Gotcha. Okay.
Vertical mix.
Okay, great. So then in terms of the growth drivers, maybe we could start with the GX browser. Obviously, we've been talking about this for a while, but my sense is it still has a lot of legs left. And just wondering if you could give us an update on what you're seeing there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a product that's growing very nicely. I think it's grown more than 50% since the beginning of last year. But it's still only at 22 million users out of our 320 million-ish total. So we still think of it as one of our key growth drivers in the company. We've tried to size the market. It's very hard, right? It's a product made for gamers, PC gamers, but the team looks at it as sort of the combination of Gen Z and PC gamers, and then internationally outside China, where we don't offer products, that's at least 400 million. So we mentally think of it at, maybe we're at 5%-ish market share in that sweet spot segment, but it still feels like very early days in terms of raising awareness about the product, because once we get people onto it, it's our best performing product, strong reviews, best engagement metrics, best monetization. So being also a bit of a test in terms of what it's like to make a browser tailored for a specific segment, it's proven to work pretty well, and we still have high ambitions for it.
So just if we can drill down on that a little bit, I know that you won't want to get too specific, so maybe we could just put this in terms of, you mentioned 22 million users today out of 300 million total, but obviously we know that we should never expect you to have, I assume, 300 million people using the GX browser. But what would you consider to be mature for the GX? Is it 50 million? Is it 75? Is it 30?
Yeah, I mean, it's the only browser made for gamers out there, so it's very hard to say. It continues to grow nicely.
Is a global number.
Yeah, it's a global number. It continues to grow nicely. How big it can get, I don't know. I don't want to cap it, but we expect it will continue to grow. It's doing very well. It's also helping us grow in Western markets with far better monetization than emerging markets, and it's also inspired us to think that we can use this logic to sort of be a bit more segment oriented in our promotion and marketing in our products.
Now, obviously, gamers, right? We know there's a lot of gamers, but I guess if we think about the 22 million users that you have on GX today, do we know, are they, to what extent are they hardcore gamers? And I guess, again, I'm trying to get at, should we think about the 22 million as sort of very low penetration versus the total universe of people that are really interested in games, or is it really only the hardcore user that is ever going to use a GX browser in your view?
We think of it as 5-ish% penetration in that sort of intersection that I mentioned. Yeah. I think it does appeal to the hardcore gamers, but also, I mean, it's ties with the broader sort of setup that people that are PC gamers tend to have, their equipment, what their interests are, what integrations they want in the product, the technical features of the product. But it also works, like if you show it to a teenager, it might not be in, hardcore people think it's cool. So, yeah.
So I guess one way to think about it, and you might not say it, but I'll say it, 5% penetration today, you're the only browser of its type, so could that go to 20 or 30%? I mean, why couldn't it, I guess I would say?
We don't know yet.
Yeah.
We don't know yet. But it's really, on that product, it's definitely not about convincing people to stay with it. It's convincing people or allowing people to discover it. So we work with influencers to talk about it. We run some marketing campaigns for it. We try to... It's like an awareness game.
Yeah.
Tech articles, other partners in the ecosystem that can talk about it helps.
Well, that's actually a really good point. So are you able to track the kind of engagement with the user and how do those trends look? So in other words, it's not just about the number of users, but it's how frequently they're using and what they're doing on the browser and so forth.
Yeah, it is it's the product with the highest usage statistics we have. I mean, I think all our products are good, but I'm a little biased. But I think it's just that segment uses their computer more than most other people. They spend more time in front of the screen, and so it becomes a very valuable thing for a browser company to be the browser for gamers.
And that hasn't begun to sort of reverse course now that we're coming out of COVID and some of us are spending more time outdoors? I mean, you haven't seen that in the gaming community, I guess.
No, I mean, it's been growing so quickly. I mean, it was barely beginning during COVID,
Sure.
so it's hard to say if it would have been even like 10% better if we still had the pandemic. But we don't, we're happy that we are where we are. Okay,
so let's pivot into the sports. That's becoming another big affinity for you, and football, soccer in particular. How is that trending? And could you sort of help us think about what the strategy is there and how that's evolved?
Yeah, it's more on the content side to begin with. So we have a product called Opera News, or operates under a few brands in different markets, with about 200 million people accessing that. It's an AI-based platform that serves up content based on your interest, etc. That's been out for several years. But then what we did was that we essentially just took that technology and said, okay, let's calibrate it to European soccer or to cricket in India, and then create like a website and app around that. I think we announced we had hit 50 million people using that on a monthly basis after 6 months of launch. So it's a way to create more, let's say, niche-based ways of communicating information of particular interest with the same backend and technology that we already have.
And so how do you monetize that?
The same as we monetize all the content with advertisement.
Are you seeing a differential or improved rates by virtue of being able to more directly target the specific affinity, or is it it's just about...
I'm actually not sure of how it compares to the like-for-like broader news in terms of engagement, etc. in the markets, but I think it's a way to just open up more. I mean, we're an independent company. We compete against the pre-installed and the default and the operating system.
More about volume than
so, right. Yeah, so for us, it's just different ways of sort of, okay, that's an angle that some people found interesting, because we always have to give people a reason to change a habit. Like, I'm used to opening Chrome when I go online, let me try to open Opera instead. And then if they like it, they might just import their bookmarks and all of that. And the more people use it, the stickier it gets.
Do you think that, if we think about this using the hackneyed phrase of the baseball analogy, like with sports content, where are we sort of in the second or third inning there, or no? Is this something that you guys have been working on for a long time and kind of...
How many innings are there?
9.
9, okay. Yeah, I mean, we're 6 months in, so in the context of like a nearly 30-year-old company, it's still early days. Yeah. Even though we still operate like a startup, I think we do want to broaden that. We want to. That's on the content side. Take our lessons from that, or lessons from the gaming browser into sort of the broader browser space too. So yeah, it's something that we plan to keep cultivating.
Okay. Are there others that are sort of on the drawing board, and maybe you don't want to talk about specifically what they are, but would you expect that we'll be talking more about new areas of interest going forward, or?
I think the underlying strategy of considering which are segments that we can both reach in a good way, and that have something in common that makes like a product can serve a need, and that we see that there can be a valuable segment. That is something that our product teams and the broader market-oriented teams do spend a lot of time on.
And I guess where I'm going with this is, you look at the growth rates that the company has been putting up. It's growing 20+% a year on the top line, and the margins are improving. Clearly, if you look at how the securities are priced, right, the expectation is that growth is going to slow down appreciably. I would argue in a very short term. Yet we're not really seeing any signs of that. But how do you think about maintaining these levels of growth, or should we expect that this is going to be a maturing company relatively quickly, and maybe it's 5 to 10% revenue growth for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I mean, when we made our guidance for the year, it was about 20% or so revenue growth.
Organic.
It's organic, and we have still, even though the US has been one of our fastest growing markets, still a very small footprint. So it's with an international business that suffers against the strength of the dollar. We have like 6, 7, in Q1 we reported, I think, 22-ish% growth. We've been 29 on a constant currency basis. So that's the velocity that we had underlying it. And I think the reason we managed to do that is that we're still small, in particular in Western markets. So we benefit from even what's from the outside. You're like, okay, Opera, single digits market share is small, but going from whatever 2 to 3 is a 50% increase. So I think we have a business that operates really well at our current scale. We have an OpEx base that's pretty stable, irrespective of our size in terms of like salary and infrastructure and so on. Limited incremental cost of growth, and then when we are managing to create products that get attention and get more people to like, oh, maybe I could try this, then that is very beneficial to us. Good economics of scale.
Sure. And this migration of users, so to speak, from the India and Africa to the Western markets in Western Europe and the U.S., to your point, I mean, we did some analysis. I was trying to impute a differential ARPU, so to speak, or revenue per user, and I was coming up with like an 8 to 10-fold increase in terms of the value of a U.S. or Western Europe user versus African India. Is that sort of about the right?
Yeah, I think that's about the right level. It's much more valuable in terms of
it's not percentage terms. It's
it's multiples times over. Even U.S. to Europe, U.S. is better than Europe. Western Europe is better than Eastern, and then you have sort of emerging markets.
Sure.
So that the fact that we are able to, with gaming, now sort of with all the focus around AI and AI-generated content, etc., that stuff that makes the browser interesting, that receives attention, is a great tailwind for us. And it's allowing us to, even though we monetize in the same market as everyone else, we have much more maneuverability in terms of our footprint.
And just to sort of drill down on we'll get to AI in a second, I promise, but just you mentioned that even in the U.S. versus Western Europe, you're seeing a big increase in revenue per user. Is that sort of also kind of like, multiples of what you're seeing in Western Europe, or is that more just,
it's not like 5, but it's incrementally better.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I know the 300 million users, you used to break out, do you still break out how many users you have in each of those 4 regions, U.S., Western Europe, India, Africa?
We don't report it specifically by region, even though it's not a big secret, but I'll just refrain from that then. But we have still the vast majority of our users in emerging markets. With Africa being the biggest region, and then Asia second biggest. But we also have a majority of our revenue still from Western markets, and that's already the case. And those are the revenues that are growing the fastest.
Okay, gotcha. And then so how is it that you're fueling this migration, right? I mean, you're not physically. Is it just mostly by designing products that you think will resonate more with a Western audience versus the product that you were designing 5 years ago, or are you just spending more marketing dollars in these countries? And what's the strategy?
I think we've always had a good foothold, in particular in Europe, maybe because we are a European company, etc. But kind of like the browser for geeks, like the ones who are super technical and want to get into it, very lively communities, and it's just very technical. And you hear it if you make like a version upgrade that changes a shortcut or something. And then broadening it to, we started with sort of a privacy. We built in VPN, we built in an ad blocker that people can trust, like plugins, for example. And then with gaming, and then we always have to cater to not the geeky nature of ourselves, but we have to be before the big ones. Like we have to come up with stuff that they don't have. We tend to get copied on most of what we do. Like there's not a single browser out there that doesn't support multiple tabs, but that was like an Opera invention, or like a URL bar search, or some of these other things, data compression for emerging markets mainly. So they copy it, and then we have to stay ahead. But it's also like in Opera, the coolest place for an engineer to be is in the browser development team. But that might not be the case in the giant companies, right? That
it's probably not.
So we managed that for like decades to just be a bit ahead.
And that brings us to AI, right? Where it looks like you're staking out some early leads there as well. Could you talk about your collaboration with OpenAI, and how much does this really show up in terms of the usage of your products versus just, hey, this is a headline that we want to make because AI is the rage today?
Yeah, no, we are super excited about it. We've been talking as a public company for years now. Browser is actually quite important. It's important in the privacy center. It's a move from Web 2 to Web 3, which was, I guess, the big talk maybe a year ago. But as a more like strategic asset again, post the sort of major app-based logins. Then I think with the emergence of these AI tools that help people be more productive or have fun or whatever, whether it's text or visual, I think it again is a phase that makes more people think the thought that, I could actually choose another browser than the one that's there on the menu bar from the device. So I think that works well with us. I think we benefit in that context from being an independent company. So if you're Google, you kind of have to go with Bard, and if you're Microsoft, you sort of embed with OpenAI, etc. And we are an independent company that can work with everyone. And so our partnership with OpenAI started some months back. I think probably good for them too, to not only be like the edge AI, but to stand on its own feet and have more outlets for their tech. And we've been we keep integrating more services to it. We always bundle, or not bundle, but let's say we support good integrations in our products. Like we have, when you're in our browser, you can watch your TikTok feed or read your Facebook or WhatsApp messages without leaving the site. Like it's built in. And so we started very simple. We're just building in a ChatGPT. Like you just click it on the sidebar and it pops up and you're still on the web and you have that thing here. We've integrated it in the product so that if you select some text, you can like, what does this mean? Or create a funny picture of this, or summarize this page for me, or what's the takeaways, etc. We've launched our own let's say AI assistant. It's just starting to roll out now. Aria, like the opera name, which is sort of existing on top. Yeah.
So before we get into Aria, just one question about the integration with ChatGPT. Is that available on mobile as well, or is that only on the desktop? And if so, is it iOS or just Android? Or
we've launched it on desktop first. It's coming out on Android, still not on iOS, but of course it's the direction we want to go.
Yeah. Okay. I say that with some self-interest, given that I'm stuck with Apple products myself. Okay. And so then last week you launched Aria. I love that the browser actually named itself, or that the technology named itself. That's actually quite interesting. But how exactly, or what are some of the ways in which Aria is going to improve the AI user's experience? Because it's not a new browser; it's a new technology that rests within the browser. If I understand it correctly.
Yeah, it's a tool that comes with the browser. You have it now on our PC products, as you mentioned. The thought is to have like a more seamless interaction between your web surfing and your sort of, let's say, AI assistants on the side, so that you can have the conversation while you're on web pages. You can get suggested links and you can explore them. So we use the ChatGPT functionality, but we also feed in relevant data points to behind the scenes, so that it's able to comment on like real time information on top.
And how do you, is this being done under a licensing arrangement, or is there sort of any kind of revenue sharing that goes on with ChatGPT or GPT or OpenAI? I mean, I'm just wondering how you have access to this.
There's a regular licensing setup.
Okay, and Aria is available in 180 countries, I believe. Is that true today?
I think it's more or less everywhere where it would be relevant.
Okay, and I guess then the question is how broadly penetrated do you expect that this will ultimately be? Is this 5 years from now, will we be talking about 22 million users the way we're talking about GX today using Aria, or do you see this becoming a more of a faster ramp to get to the 300 million penetration?
I mean, we are enabling it as a tool in all our browsers eventually. So that means that all our 300 million will have access to it.
Right, okay.
And then I think we are not ourselves developing a language model, or we have developed AI, but it's a decision model in terms of like content people might like and advertising and so on. But we want to integrate good services and create a good assistant to people that makes them enjoy our browsers as our primary objective, and lets more people discover us. I think that technology is obviously like super new still. But yeah, if I were to guess, I think it would be very common for all of us in 5 years to have like invested in some kind of an AI relationship with some technology that knows you, and that you don't have to put all the context into something you wonder, but you sort of have that thing on the side where you can ask and you get a contextualized answer tailored to yourself.
So it's a little bit more of a mass product for your...
Yeah, I think it will be.
Okay, so we just have a couple minutes left. I definitely want to talk about capital allocation and asset sales. Obviously, that's been something where you've been very active over the past several years. When I started following Opera, it was a bit of a hodgepodge. You had a bunch of different JV stakes, and now you've really streamlined that down. You still have the one stake left. I think it's 9.5% of OPay that you've talked about. You've got it marked at $163 million. I'm just wondering, when can we expect you, or when should we expect you to monetize that stake? Is that a 2023 event? And maybe you could, if it's easier, you could remind us, you had a larger stake in OPay, if I remember, and you sold some of it. And what were the circumstances around that? What drove that transaction? And how did the sale of the first piece of OPay that you sold, how did the price compare with how you had it marked at the time?
Yeah, you're right. We've had stakes in 3 companies that Opera participated in creating or building up or scaling. They've been great dollar-wise, profit-wise investments, but nobody really in the market. It was just too much complexity, I think. So we never really got an appreciation for that. So 2 out of 3 are now out, and we're left with just the one, OPay. OPay, we participated as a founding shareholder back in 2017, I think, but haven't really participated in it. It's raised hundreds of millions of capital to become a leading mobile money operator in Nigeria and many other markets. We sold I think our cash in for our initial investment, 6.5%, as it stood at the end of last year, was $12 million.
Wow.
We sold a third of it for 50. So I mean, it's been a great. The cost base on that sale was like $4 million or something. And then we had after that we had 6.5%, and then we settled another sale with actually OPay shares. So we went from 6.5 to 9.5%. We hold it as held for sale on our balance sheet, which means that our intention is to sell it within 6 months.
Okay.
It's not a commitment, but it's an intention. And I think we no longer participate in the company. It's doing great on its own. It's a completely separate company. We played a more important role in the beginning while we had all those shares at such low cost. So we don't need to hold it, but we also don't have a rush to sell it. So it's if a good buyer comes along, we'll sell it, or else the company will just mature into its own IPO, I'm sure, and that will be our exit.
Great. Okay. Well, we're out of time. So thank you very much for your time.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Thanks again.